There are a few principles of requirements validation that can help you as a requirements engineer to do a better job. In general, there are 6 principles, and in the next few slides, we'll work through each of those principles one by one. First, involve the correct stakeholders for the requirements validation process. That means, for example, that the author of the requirement should not be the one that validates the requirements, because that if I'm writing this, I might have prior knowledge which influences how I validate the requirement. Especially when we're looking back to ambiguity and also completeness, if I don't have a background on this requirement, it might be easier for me to really think like a person that has to maybe implement the requirement. Also involve internal auditors. The stakeholders that are members of the developing organization should put an internal auditor that you can work with. And you also need maybe external auditors. That would be quite good, but it's a high effort and often also costly, because the external auditor really has absolutely no background on the project, and it takes a lot of time to become familiar with the document, but it's very nice to really have an independent perspective, not just on the requirements, but also the requirements document and the whole process, so you can get very, very valuable feedback, but don't expect to get an external auditor that often. Second principle, separating the identification and the correction of errors. Please make sure to really first identify a flaw, then document the flaw, and then fix the flaw. Don't mix up this process, don't rush it. Identify, document, and fix. Separation allows concentration on the identification, then you document, then you fix. So it's better separation of resources, and also you don't mess up things in between. Third, validation from different views. Get different people with different perspective to have a look at the requirements and then decide whether they are sufficient or not. And the fourth principle is an adequate change of documentation types. Check really if the used documentation types for a requirement balance out each other's weaknesses. So I have talked about the advantages of natural language. It's very expressive, very universal, very flexible, but has problems with abstraction and documenting complex behavior, which on the other side is something that conceptual models can do very well. But even within the family of conceptual models, there are some tools that can do this part very well and others can do that part very well. So make sure that in the end, the documentation of a requirement is properly done and that the weaknesses of different approaches balance each other out. Fifth principle that is worth adhering to is the construction of development artifacts. For example, you could try to create a test case to validate a requirement to reveal ambiguities, because if you have troubles creating the test case, that might tell you that there is something wrong with the requirement if you cannot create a test case for that. And then sixth, this is an iterative approach. Do repeated validation. A positive validation at one point does not guarantee that the requirement is still valid at a later point in time, especially if changes have happened in between. So the validation should be repeated in the following cases. This is not a comprehensive list, but a good list to start with. When there was lots of innovative ideas and technologies, when there's a significant gain of knowledge, when there are long-lasting projects over several years, because stuff might change, when you had a very early previous validation, when you were involved in an unknown domain, or, and this is very important, if you reuse requirements. Don't trust them with your life, validate them again.